hard place. Disclaimer: all names, locations, and identifiable details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. This podcast is an account of a real investigative operation conducted by South Wales Private Investigations. Listener discretion is advised, as some scenes may be intense or upsetting.
My name is Charlotte, and I'm an investigator for South Wales Private Investigations. The story I'm about to share with you is a true account that deeply affected me on a personal level. It all took place in December 2023, but even now, there are many days when I still think about that child. The snow was falling softly outside my office window in Aberdare, Wales. The valleys were blanketed in white, a picturesque postcard scene that contrasted sharply with the reality of where I was headed. Barnsley, a town where festive lights did little to chase away the shadows, lurking in its corners. We were about to spend the next 48 hours immersed in its cold hold. I sipped my morning tea, the warmth spreading through me as I watched the snow drift lazily by. Just then, the phone rang, piercing the quiet of my office. On the other end was a woman named Maria. Her voice trembled, yet there was an absolute urgency in it. She sounded like someone on the edge, balancing fear and hope. "Is this Charlotte from South Wales Private Investigations?" she asked. "Yes, this is Charlotte. How can I assist you?" I replied. She took a shaky breath before explaining her situation. Maria had recently separated from her ex-partner, Craig, the father of her 4-year-old daughter, Crystal. She had discovered that Craig was involved in activities that put their daughter at risk. Despite her pleas, the authorities wouldn't act without solid evidence, and the courts had granted them equal custody. She feared for Crystal's safety during the times she was at her father's house. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I can't bear the thought of my little girl in that environment. I need proof to protect her." For a moment, I glanced at the photograph on my desk, a picture of me and my younger brother taken years ago. It was a reminder of why I chose this line of work. I couldn't turn her away. "I understand," I said, gently. "I'll take the case." After hanging up, I paused briefly, considering the weight of what lay ahead. Cases involving children were always delicate. A single mistake could cost a child their safety. I took a deep breath and dialed my colleague, Mark, a seasoned investigator of 25 years. Mark was from up north, had a keen eye for detail, and wasn't one to hesitate when it mattered. "Mark, we've got a job. This one's complicated and time-critical," I told him, my voice firm. "Are you up for a trip to Barnsley?" "Always," he replied, without a moment's hesitation. We agreed to conduct 48 hours of round-the-clock surveillance on Craig's residence. I began packing my gear: a camera with a long lens, spare batteries, notebooks, and some food supplies. These situations often meant long hours of waiting, and I wanted to be prepared. As I gathered my things, a familiar unease settled in my chest. These cases were tricky, delicate. One misstep, and a child could be lost to the system, or worse. The next morning, we set off early. The drive was uneventful: long stretches of motorway, empty fields shrouded in mist, and the occasional car speeding by. As we entered Barnsley, though, the atmosphere shifted. The festive decorations hung over the streets, bright and cheery, but they felt out of place. It was as if someone had draped tinsel over something rotten, trying to hide it. We passed a group of youths, huddled in an alleyway, their faces half hidden by the hoods of their jackets. They watched our van as we passed, their eyes narrowed. The festive cheer felt like a cruel joke in this part of town, where despair clung to everything like fog. We parked our van a few houses down from Craig's dilapidated council house, a structure with peeling paint and a front garden littered with debris. A broken tricycle lay on its side, rusting away, and the curtains of the house were drawn tightly shut. The place felt like a reflection of Craig himself, neglected, dark, and hiding secrets. Mark set up the surveillance equipment, his hands moving with practiced ease. He positioned the camera so we could get a clear view of the front door and the windows. As he adjusted the focus, I watched the street, my senses heightened. Somewhere, in that house, was a little girl, caught in the middle of something she couldn't understand. "Let's get comfortable," Mark said, settling into his seat. "We're going to be here a while." I nodded, my eyes never leaving the house. The wind picked up, rattling a loose board on the fence. This was just the beginning. 48 hours to gather enough evidence to find something that would help Maria protect her daughter. And as the snow continued to fall, I hoped we were in time. Hours passed as we watched a steady stream of visitors come and go, some staying only minutes before leaving hurriedly, others entering with vacant expressions and exiting in a daze. "He seems busy," Mark observed, his voice a low murmur in the dim light of the van. "Yes," I agreed, my eyes fixed on the front door. "But we need something more concrete." Late into the night, the activity intensified. Craig emerged multiple times, engaging in quick exchanges with individuals under the dim streetlights outside of his house. His movements were fast, almost rehearsed. Small packages exchanged for cash, the handshake lasting a second too long. "Got him," Mark whispered, snapping photos. The shutter sound felt louder in the tense silence of the van. We documented everything, but I knew we needed irrefutable evidence to compel the authorities to act. The faces we were seeing weren't enough. Their hasty exits only hinted at something wrong. But hints wouldn't save Crystal. By the end of the first day, our frustration was obvious. Mark and I returned to the hotel late that night. We ordered something to eat, though neither of us had much appetite. The dim glow from the TV cast shadows across the room, the news droning on without any of it sinking in. The food sat untouched, and the air between us felt heavy, burdened by the knowledge that, despite everything, we were no closer to helping Crystal. "We're not getting enough," Mark said, finally breaking the silence. He was frowning, his brow furrowed in thought. "The authorities will need more than what we've got. They won't act on a few shady handshakes." I nodded, staring at the crumpled paper bag on the table. My mind was racing, trying to figure out our next step. Every instinct I had told me we were running out of time. Crystal didn't have the luxury of waiting for us to get everything perfect. Mark sighed. "We could try getting closer, but..." He trailed off, knowing exactly what that meant. We both knew it. There was a line we weren't supposed to cross, rules that were in place to keep us safe, to ensure that we weren't compromised. But when it came to children, when it came to someone like Crystal, trapped and scared, those rules felt like chains, holding us back from doing what needed to be done. I looked at Mark, my decision already made. "I'm going in." Mark's eyes widened slightly. "Charlotte, you know what that means. If you get caught..." I cut him off, my voice steady but filled with determination. "If I don't, who knows what will happen to her? She's just a kid, Mark. I'm not going to sit here and watch her slip through the cracks because we played it safe." He hesitated, then nodded. He knew me well enough to realise there was no changing my mind.
Just a quick message before we continue. If you're enjoying Rock in a Hard Place and would like to hear more real-life investigative stories, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing but shows us that you're enjoying our content. Your support helps us continue to share these compelling stories with you. Now, let's get back to the story.
"We'll need a plan," he said, his voice resigned but supportive. The following morning, I donned my disguise, worn-out clothes, a hooded jacket, and scuffed boots that gave me the appearance of someone down on their luck. Mark handed me a small wire, his face grim. "Just in case," he said quietly, pressing the earpiece into my hand. "If anything happens, I'm right here." I gave him a nod, my throat tight with nerves. The van seemed to grow colder as I stepped out, the icy wind biting at my exposed skin. I pulled the hood lower over my face, each step towards Craig's house, feeling like I was walking deeper into a dangerous unknown. The crunch of snow under my boots was the only sound in the silent morning. The neighbourhood seemed asleep, but I knew better. Eyes were watching, always watching. As I approached Craig's door, my heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I knocked on the door. There was a long pause before it opened, the door creaking on its hinges to reveal Craig's wary face. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his features as he looked me up and down. "What do you want?" he asked, bluntly, his voice as rough as the crumbling plaster around the doorway. "I was told you could help me out," I said, injecting a slight quiver into my voice, letting my eyes dart around as though I were scared. And in a way, I was. Terrified of what I might find inside. Terrified of failing. He studied me, his gaze sharp. For a second, I thought he'd slam the door in my face, but then he stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "Make it quick," he muttered, glancing towards the street before shutting the door behind me with a dull thud that seemed to reverberate through my chest. The interior was worse than I had imagined, rubbish strewn everywhere, including the needles lying over the floor, the smell of old takeaways mixed with something sour and metallic. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as I forced myself to breathe evenly. Music blared from another room, the bass rattling the thin walls. As I stood there, I heard a noise from the stairs. Slowly, I turned my head, and there she was. Crystal. She peeked out from behind the banister, her eyes wide, her grip tight around a threadbare teddy bear. Her gaze locked on mine, and I saw it. Fear, confusion, and something else. "A plea," she said in a sweet, innocent voice.
"Daddy, I'm hungry."
I forced myself to look away, to stay in character. But Craig caught me looking, his face twisted, anger flashing in his eyes. "Oi! Go back to your room!" he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. Crystal flinched at his tone, her small frame shrinking back as she disappeared into the shadows. My heart twisted painfully in my chest, my resolve hardening. This wasn't just about getting evidence anymore. This was about getting her out of here. Craig shoved a small package into my hand, his eyes never leaving me. "Take it and get out," he said, his voice low, dangerous. I nodded, sliding the cash into his hand before turning away, my steps quickening as I moved towards the door. The cold air hit me like a wave as I stepped back outside, my breath visible in the frigid morning. I kept my head down until I was back at the van. Mark opened the door, his eyes scanning me for any sign of trouble. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight. "I saw Crystal," I whispered, sliding into the seat, my hands trembling. "She's in there, Mark. She's living in that hellhole." His expression darkened, his jaw clenching. "We need to act. Now." Mark and I sat in the van for what felt like hours, the package now securely locked away in an evidence bag. The sun had barely begun to rise, and a chill settled over everything, despite the heater humming softly in the background. Mark broke the silence, his voice cautious, "We need to reach out to Maria," he said, looking at me. "We've got to get her involved, figure out our next step." I nodded, reaching for my phone. After everything we'd seen, we needed Maria's help, now more than ever. But when she finally answered, her tone was distant, her responses curt. There was something off, a hesitation in her voice. I pushed gently, trying to understand, but eventually, the truth surfaced. She couldn't help, not now. She had other things to handle, and she wasn't in a place to deal with Crystal. My heart sank as her words trailed off, and I realised what she meant. She was busy working, struggling to make ends meet, in a way that left her unavailable for her daughter. She was trapped in her own difficult circumstances, a woman forced to sell her body to survive, with no time or opportunity to care for Crystal. It hit me hard. Crystal wasn't just caught in a bad situation. She was truly caught between two worlds, each filled with its own dangers. A child lost between two evils. I hung up the call, my hands shaking slightly. Mark met my eyes, his expression a mix of shock and sadness. "She's got no one, does she?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I shook my head. No one. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it all settling over us like the falling snow outside. For the first time in a long time, I felt utterly helpless. We were doing everything we could, but it still didn't feel like enough. Then, as if by some strange twist of fate, the silence outside the van shattered. Voices echoed down the street, shouts growing louder, angrier. Mark and I exchanged a look, our instincts kicking in. I turned towards the house, my breath catching as I saw Craig in the front garden, his face contorted with rage. He was shouting at two other men, his gestures wild and aggressive. The men were shouting back, their words lost in the cold wind. A fight broke out, punches thrown, bodies shoving one another against the fence. The tension had snapped, and all hell had broken loose. I grabbed my phone, my fingers moving quickly as I dialed 999. Mark was already focused, the camera rolling, snapping pictures, capturing every chaotic second. 999, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through, calm and steady. There's a fight. 3 men at the address I'm giving you now, I said, my voice unwavering. We're private investigators, witnessing the incident. One of the individuals is Craig, the man we've been surveilling. There's a child inside. She's in danger. The operator asked me more questions, and I answered quickly, my eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before us. Craig was yelling, his voice raw with anger, his movements erratic. Mark continued to document everything, the clicks of the camera blending with the rising tension. It wasn't long before we heard them, sirens growing louder, flashing blue lights cutting through the grey morning. Police cars pulled up, officers spilling out, their voices commanding as they approached the scene. Craig resisted at first, his body rigid, his face twisted in defiance. But the officers moved swiftly, and before long, we watched as they pulled his hands behind his back, cuffing him and leading him towards a patrol car. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, explaining what we'd been doing there, what we had seen, and the evidence we had gathered. The officers spoke to us briefly, taking our statements, nodding as I handed over the secured evidence bag, detailing Maria's situation and the danger Crystal was in. But even as I spoke, my mind was elsewhere. Inside that house, with the little girl who had no one looking out for her. Then, almost as if in answer to my silent prayers, another car arrived. A different kind, without the lights and sirens. A woman stepped out, her expression gentle but focused. Social services. I watched as she walked up to the house, disappearing inside for what felt like an eternity. And then, she emerged, holding Crystal in her arms. The little girl was wrapped in a blanket, her face buried against the social worker's shoulder. But as they approached the car, Crystal looked up, her eyes meeting mine through the window of the van. And she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and uncertain, but it was there. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. The social worker spoke softly to her, and Crystal nodded, her little fingers clutching the blanket as they settled her into the car. I let out a breath I hadn't realised I was holding, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Mark was quiet beside me, his gaze fixed on the scene outside. "They're taking her somewhere safe," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I nodded, my heart swelling with a mix of relief and sadness. "Yeah," I whispered. "Somewhere better." As the car pulled away, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the street in white, covering the chaos that had unfolded here. It was far from a perfect ending, but as Crystal disappeared down the road, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better for her. Sometimes, in this line of work, we come across situations that seem impossible. Places where it feels like there are no good choices, only the lesser of evils. But every so often, something shifts, and we find a way through. Seeing that little girl smile, even if just for a moment, reminded me that there's always hope, even in the darkest of places. It's true. Sometimes being stuck between a rock and a hard place still leaves room for a happy ending. Rock and a Hard Place has been brought to you by South Wales Private Investigations. Names and personal details have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. For more real-life investigative stories, or if you need assistance uncovering the truth in your own life, visit our website at southwalesprivateinvestigations.co.uk.